Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are stepping into the shadows of a really profound philosophical allegory. We're going to dive deep into a dark fairy tale. It's essentially a Nietzschean parable about these terrifying, yet completely essential beast-like spirits. And they exist for one singular purpose: to subvert absolute certainty. It's a fascinating story about the inherent dangers of rigid control and the strange, liberating alchemy of chaos. This quote perfectly sets the stage for what we can call the tragedy of forced order. I want you to imagine a world governed by a total obsession with absolute control, a state where the ruling classes, the sorcerers and kings of our fable, demand that reality itself has to conform to pristine, rigid, gray blueprints. They want time, space, and world building perfectly measured and predicted. But in doing so, they hold reality breathless. They literally suffocate the very essence of existence by refusing to allow anything to exist outside their perfectly drawn lines.
Part 1. The Calcified World and the Infinite Dungeon of Absolute Certainty.
To really understand the beasts of our story, we first have to look at the world before they arrived. When a ruling class enforces strict, static control, the world begins to calcify. It hardens. And just like anything that becomes entirely rigid, it risks completely shattering under its own suffocating tension. We're looking at two fundamentally opposing views of existence here. On one hand, you have the Apollonian desire of kings, those gray blueprints. This represents static control, precise equations of isolation, and a breathless, predictable world. But on the other hand, we have the Dionysian reality, messy improvisation. This is the unscripted comedy of life. It's the unpredictable smudges on a page, the sudden breeze that dances. The tragedy of forced order happens when that rigid control tries to completely eradicate the messy reality of life. Part 2. The Blackened Well, the Catalyst of Chaos. So, before the world totally calcified, there were these mischievous little entities known as imps. And they existed freely in the map's white spaces. The uncharted, uncontrolled areas. But as the sorcerers and kings began drafting all of reality into their rigid systems, a dark essence began to pool together in those margins. This became known as the ink of negation. It's defined as the gathered essence of discarded idols and ancient traumas. Think of this in a deeply Nietzschean sense. When you shatter the stained glass cathedrals of old dogmatic beliefs, the shattered pieces and forgotten traumas don't just disappear, right? They gather. They pool together in the darkness, carrying this heavy, potent ink that's required to write entirely new truths. If we track how this evolved, we start with the age of imps, where these entities are really just mischievous. Nothing too crazy. Then comes the gathering, where the oppressive order of the kings causes that ink of negation to pool up. And finally, we hit the breaking point, the mercurial awakening. The imps drink from this blackened well of negation and undergo a terrifying transformation. They evolve from minor nuisances into the beast-like spirits of the spill. They become the primal, undeniable authors of chaos. Part 3. The Wit Dismantles Ego, the Zeitgeist of the Hammer. Our first parable focuses on the eldest sibling's awakening. This happened during a time of brutal unmasking, when a figure known as the Wanderer wielded his iron hammer of genealogy to shatter the false histories and stained glass cathedrals of his ancestors. It was an era totally ripe for dismantling the ego of the ruling class. In this climate, the eldest sibling underwent a mercurial awakening and became the Wit, a beast of distorting mirrors. And what does a distorting mirror do? It warps our perception of ourselves. The Wit was born to see straight through the ruling class's grandest illusion, their profound belief that their authority was set in immutable, unbreakable stone. The absolutely crucial thing here is how the Wit operates. He doesn't use physical force. Instead, he uses the distorting mirror of laughter to dismantle authoritarian logic. By exposing their supposedly immutable stone chins as nothing more than cheap papier-mâché, he reveals the deeply human, trembling hands, hiding right behind the mask of absolute power. Through mockery, the Wit ensures that the gothic dusk of the Wanderer's mind collapses entirely into a heap of delightful absurdity. Because, let's face it, authority just cannot survive being laughed at. Part 4. The Hunger Devours Logic, the Zeitgeist of the Void. Our second parable kicks off when the sun of absolute certainty finally set, leaving the Wanderer trapped in a dark, structural maze of his own isolation and logic. And in this terrifying darkness, the second sibling experienced its mercurial awakening, emerging as the Hunger. The Hunger is a beast of endless, gaping consumption. It literally represents the void in the logic. And as it looked out at the sorcerers weaving their endless tapestries of control, it realized something fascinating. The rigid expectations of the wise are incredibly nutritious. So how does this beast unbind reality? Well, the hunger literally devours authoritarian logic. It swallows the restrictive threads of order. It feasts heavily on the sorcerer's incredibly detailed tapestry of order and law. By eating the very foundations of their carefully planned reality, the hunger transforms their precise equations of isolation into a total cacophony of how did this happen? And this consumption is vital. Without it, the walls of the infinite dungeon would set into permanent stone. Part 5. Unbinding Through Whim, the Zeitgeist of the Breeze. Now, even with the wit and the hunger doing their thing, the world still grew stiff and breathless beneath the heavy weight of forced order. It was in this suffocating climate that the youngest sibling awoke and became the Small. I absolutely love this description. She is the breeze that reminds a stiff world how to dance. The Small is the spirit of unpredictable whim. She's the champion of those seemingly insignificant, artful mistakes that actually end up shaping the true course of reality. See, the Small unbinds the world, not with a hammer or a void, but through highly strategic whim. She subverts these grand, tragic fates through the most minor disruptions you can imagine. A sudden hiccup, an accidentally spilled cup of tea that just happens to blur the perfectly drawn ink on a brutal royal treaty. These tiny, chaotic disruptions act as an essential pressure valve against rigid, authoritarian control. She proves that total systemic dominance can be completely undone by the smallest stroke of chance. Let's pause the narrative for a second, because we really need to ask the ultimate philosophical question of this whole explainer. When we look at these three terrifying, chaos-inducing spirits of the spill, the wit, the hunger, and the small, we have to ask, do they seek to destroy the world of order, or are they actually trying to save it? Part 6, the grand unscripted comedy, embracing the alchemy of chaos. The answer is that their collective purpose is absolutely not destruction. It's the liberation of reality itself. They exist to break us out of that infinite dungeon of absolute certainty, where time and space are choked by gray blueprints. By introducing mocking laughter, devouring restrictive logic, and slipping in those artful mistakes, they transform the tragedy of forced order into a grand, unscripted comedy. They are the vital smudges and leaks in the system. They ensure that human life remains a beautifully messy improvisation, rather than a sterile, entirely predictable, and ultimately fatal final tragedy. And this brings us to what might be the most striking quote from our sources today. Through the actions of these spirits, like the small literally spilling a cup of tea on a treaty, they blur the ink so profoundly that they change a decree of execution into a decree of desert. It's wild, right? But this is the ultimate joyful triumph of Dionysian chaos over the grim Apollonian rigidity of the sorcerers and kings. So, I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder. We all face systems, expectations, and rulers that demand our lives conform to perfectly pristine, breathless blueprints. But if absolute authority demands perfect stone to survive, where will you find your spilled cup of tea? Where is your essential, liberating smudge of chaos? Thank you so much for exploring the dark, beautiful alchemy of chaos with me today. Stay curious and embrace the unscripted comedy.